Hello, thank you for joining me in my exploration of putting together two of my main passions, travel and whiskey. I have literally been around the world on cruise ships, and during that time I have kept an eye open to see what whiskey was available. In this series I have looked at some iconic blends and a couple of standout single malts. Each one has the right to be seen as landmark whiskies in their own right, and each have given me much pleasure on many occasions. This time I am looking at a giant of a whisky. Even if a salesperson in the wines and spirits section of an upmarket and famous department store answered my question of, have you got any Glenlivet, with, I am sure we do. It's a type of champagne, right? It's not, it's a whiskey, and it's a whiskey that has had an important, although some would say questionable, role in how I personally taste whiskey. There are two whiskies that when I started writing tasting notes, I described as tasting like whiskey. I went on to describe them further, but they both struck me as tasting like whiskey, in the same way that an apple tastes like an apple. Whiskies that I would occasionally use as a reset for my palate, from which to explore others from. If I wanted to appreciate the fruitiness of a Glenfarclas or the peatiness of an Ardbeg, I wouldn't start by tasting a Laphroaig or a Nomad, but a good quality balanced whiskey that tastes like how I imagine whiskey to be. Well, that is a good way to wake up the taste buds or to recalibrate them, ready to compare others against. This is a whiskey that saw in the new year with me on the only occasion I was given a free upgrade to first class on an overnight flight to New Delhi. And it is from a distillery that once allowed me to taste one of the oldest drams I have ever had, courtesy of the international brand ambassador Ian Logan at a London whisky festival. This whisky is Glenlivet, and it is a cornerstone in the whisky world. There is so much to say and so much to appreciate that I am going to jump right in. To start, one should understand that for a long time whisky was very different to how we now know it, made illegally, hidden in the hills, and made from crude small stills. The distillers would learn their skill by being shown and by practice. The conditions were variable and the outcome was inconsistent, often known as peat reek, due to the smell and the taste. It would have been firewater. On top of that, it could be adulterated with all manner of other substances. There were, however, exceptions. There were those who managed to make a product that was drinkable, even by the English. When King George IV visited in 1822, the first British monarch to do so for over 150 years, Sir Walter Scott made sure he was served whisky from the river that flows smoothly. This was Glenlivet. It was described as being as smooth as milk and long in the wood. And the king wanted more. Add to this rush changes in the law, and the start of illegal distilling began. The 1823 Excise Act reduced duties on whisky and set a fee for obtaining a licence to set up a distillery to just £10. This, coupled with heavy penalties for illegal distilling and the increased opportunities for exporting legal whisky, was a major blow to the more than 200 hidden distilleries in the area. George Smith, the son of a tenant farmer, obtained the first licence in the area and started a distillery in 1824, just 1 year after the king's discovery that he wanted more. In doing so, he faced real threat. These were hard and hostile times. The weather on the high areas of Glenlivet would have been a life-threatening problem for many, with hard and long winters bringing coldness and isolation. Farming was hard and the land ownership was hierarchical. Illegal distilling was not only seen as an important source of income, but as a cultural right. Why should they need a license and be taxed on something that they drink made by themselves from barley that they have grown themselves? The response of the illicit distillers to those getting licenses could be extreme. It was not unknown for there to be severe acts of violence and buildings burnt to the ground.
George had been given a set of pistols to defend himself with, but who gave him them? One might read it was the 4th Duke of Gordon. In fact, my copy of the Scottish Whisky Distilleries by Misaku Udo, seen by many as a main reference on whisky, states that the pistols were a gift from the Duke. The Duke had many reasons to look after the interest of his tenants, including those who distilled, but was also aware of his obligations as well as the possible benefits. In fact, the early days of the 1823 Act had some unexpected effects. The lowering of tax rates did not just apply to whisky, but to other spirits as well. This lowered the cost of imported spirits, namely rum, which began to become more desirable. This hit the likes of George Smith hard as profits fell dramatically. As a result, he auctioned off much of his other interests, such as farm equipment and cattle. The 4th Duke of Gordon was one who quietly helped George financially and enabled him to carry on during that difficult phase. However, the Duke could be ruled out as being the donor of the pistols because George himself said that it was the Laird of Aberlour who gave them to him. However, that can be confusing because who was the Laird of Aberlour? There is a suggestion, and one that comes from a knowledgeable source, that it was Charles Grant who became the Laird of Wester Elches in Aberlour in 1812 up to his death in 1828. There are many who believe this is the case, and it does make sense. Wester Elches is in Aberlour, and the wonders of AI says that the titles Laird of Aberlour and Laird of Wester Elches are interchangeable. However, some, such as F. Paul Picault and the Wikipedia website, suggest that it is James Gordon. If this were the case, it would support the confusion with the Duke of Gordon. In addition to this, we know that James had a keen interest in distilling, as he was a co-founder of the first Aberlour distillery. The other compelling information is that there is a record of him being referred to as a laird, and the Gordons occupied Aberlour House, with the family being known as the Gordons of Aberlour, and, according to the Patrick's People's website, he was the last Gordon Laird of Aberlour. Most convincingly for me is in James Thompson's book Recollections of a Speyside Parish, written in 1902, in which he has written a chapter 15, called The Last of the Gordon Lairds of Aberlour, in which the last laird established a distillery close to the mansion house. Now, I don't know the answer for sure, and whilst looking into it, I flipped repeatedly between the two, finally settling on James Gordon, but I could easily be wrong, especially as Wester Elches and Aberlour House would be less than 3.5 miles apart, separated by a river. And if it isn't confusing enough, just wait until an episode about Macallan, a mention of Easter Elches House, which lies between the two of them. What I do feel sure about are George's own words.
I was already a tenant of the Duke and received every encouragement in my undertaking from his Grace himself and his factor Mr. Skinner. The lookout was an ugly one though. I was warned before I began by my civil neighbours that they meant to burn the new distillery to the ground and me in the heart of it. The Laird of Aberlour presented me with a pair of hair-trigger pistols, worth 10 guineas, and they were never out of my belt for years. I got together 2 or 3 stout fellows for servants, armed them with pistols, and let it be known everywhere that I would fight for my place to the last shot. I had a pretty good character as a man of my word, And through watching, by turns, every night for years, we contrived to save the distillery from the fate so freely predicted for it. But I often, both at Kirk and Market, had rough times of it among the Glen people. And if it had not been for the Laird of Aberlour's pistols, I don't think I should have been telling you this story now. This does beg an obvious question. Did he ever use those pistols? And the answer is yes, at least twice. On one occasion, whilst travelling to deliver some stock, he was stopped by smugglers on the road between Braemere and Blairgowrie. He gave them all a dram in hope of pleasing them, but they insisted on wanting it all. George fired one pistol at the first smuggler and aimed a second at the next, whilst he shouted his command that they should go. George was not a man to be messed with, and they fled. The second time was also whilst making a delivery. He was in need of a bed for the night, and entered an inn, the Spittal of Glenshee. Inside was a group of illegal distillers who took offence at George. George ordered 6 bottles of the finest whisky to be shared amongst them, and seeing that they were calmed by his gesture, he went to bed. However, they did not stay calm for long, and led by a man named Shaw, they quietly entered George's room and surrounded his bed. Shaw took out a bloodied butcher's knife, leant over George and said, "This gully is for your bowels." But George had his pistols ready underneath the bed sheets. He flung the sheet back and held one pistol against Shaw's forehead and fired the other into the fireplace. The sound was explosive and showered the room in cinders from the fire. George shouted his conviction that if they did not all leave at once, he would create a brand new hole between Shaw's eyebrows. They all fled. Today these pistols are displayed in the distillery's visitor centre and have become a known symbol of the distillery. When the distillery had a loyalty scheme known as the Guardians, of which I was proud to be a member, I received a set of cufflinks in the shape of those pistols. I wear them often and are the only firearms I feel the desire to carry. I also received a key to the distillery's library, a place I would love to have visited, and a special pin that gave me certain perks when shown at whisky festivals and events. But returning to our thread, despite the initial need for help, business began to grow. And as it did, George developed the business to include more land, some for distilling, but also some for cattle farming, his other great love. George passed the distillery over to his son William, and William had a massive job on his hands, and he struggled to keep on top of it. One of his problems was the fact that the whisky was very desirable and under demand. At the time, much of the whisky would be shipped from Aberdeen to Leith in casks. Then the customers, usually merchants, would sell the whisky on in other containers. The merchants would be reliant on a steady and reliable supply on inaccurate measure. Unfortunately, William had difficulty in meeting these demands and could become overwhelmed with his workload. In addition to this, he found that his whisky was being targeted by what he called gallant tars. These gallant tars were the sailors who would loosen the casks, drill a small hole into them, help themselves, and then having done so, they would fill the hole, retighten the cask to conceal their deeds. William just did not know what to do about it, or how to handle the angry merchants whose orders were failing. This resulted in William seeking advice from his brother, which caused upset within the family. Despite this, the business continued to grow, and some of this may be to do with a particular merchant, Andrew Usher. He's often been seen as the pioneer of whisky blending. The truth is that people had been mixing casks for some time. It would have been an inevitable thing to happen. Usher, however, did it well, with a good whisky, with good marketing, and at a time when changes in legislation was to enable a far greater scope in doing so. Andrew Usher had a deal for 600 gallons of whisky per month on very good terms for Usher. Usher would then blend these casks, and by doing so was able to provide a reliable and consistent profile. What is more, he then marketed it as the real Glenlivet whisky. He spelt it wrong. This is seen as a major point in whisky history and, in many ways, the beginnings of the blended whisky industry, even though this actually would not be considered blended whisky by modern standards. It was only malt whisky for one distillery being mixed together, meaning it would still be considered as being a single malt. Usher played an important role in promoting the name of the Glenlivet at a time when whisky was gaining a larger market and at a time when William was struggling. The Glenlivet's reputation continued to rise and demand grew. In 1853, that was the year that the Act to impose additional duties on spirits in Scotland and Ireland came in, which made it possible to mix malt and grain whiskies together and enabled Usher to release a true blended whisky, mixing in grain whisky as well. This is when he launched Usher's Old Vatted Glenlivet, spelt correctly. This was not the easy partnership that whisky romantics might like to think it was. George Smith had been friends with Andrew Usher for a long time and had made the deal with him without William's knowledge or agreement. William was not happy with the terms of the agreement, was struggling to meet demands, and had not been happy about Usher selling it under a name that wasn't even spelt correctly. However, despite their many problems, they managed to keep working together. As Ushers passed the business on to following generations, Glenlivet, however, had to pass it the other way. George had, in essence, passed the distillery on to his son William, but William was unwell. William and his brother John had had their problems, but eventually John had to return home and helped his brother. William soon passed away due to tuberculosis. Devastated by this, George had to take over Glenlivet again. But Glenlivet grew, expanded, and eventually moved to a larger site. Its reputation also grew and was even mentioned by Charles Dickens. George formed it into a new company, George and J.G. Smith. The new site required a new distillery, and this was to be a modern design. Water came from Josie's well, which served the farm, the residences, and the distillery needs. The complex was a 2-floor construction with the grain stored at the top from where it could come down to the malting floor. This was a purpose-built venture and was of a significant size for its time. In many ways, it was leading the way forward, and soon they had to build even more warehouses. New railroad connections in 1863 enabled even greater opportunities. But one of the problems with being a leader and forging new ground is that you take on the risks and others can then easily follow behind. Glenlivet was leading the way, and soon came others with not unfamiliar profiles. In fact, it was so popular and had so many others following it that it faced another new challenge. Others would argue that Glenlivet was the name of the region and that they could also use that name, as did J.A. Fleming Jr. in his letter of 1884, in which he outlined that Aberlour and 9 other distilleries had been using the term for over 60 years and will continue to do so. In the famous book by Aeneas MacDonald, Whisky, he mentions that the Glenlivet is a district. John Gordon Smith, had actually registered Glenlivet as a trademark in 1875, using his solicitor E.D. Jameson to do so. However, when Jameson made the application, he did so using the name Glenlivet on a decorative background and not just the name itself. This established the leeway for others to continue using the name as long as it didn't have the decorative background. But that didn't stop him taking further legal actions in the 1880s. He put forward the argument that the trademark should be applied to the name without the graphic, and followed on to systematically sue the other distilleries. Many of the other distilleries were not going down without a fight and made counterclaims. They would argue that the name Glenlivet was a term used to describe whiskey of good quality and had been used for decades by illicit distillers. In effect, they argued that it was an accepted term in public use. The legal battles were many, big and expensive. John had the support of ushers who may have helped with the legal cost. In essence, John won the battles in 1884, but at a cost. There were 10 distilleries, however, that he allowed to continue to use it, taking comfort, maybe, in his being the only one who could be called the Glenlivet. It didn't stop though, and new ones continued to come up. This became so much of a problem that Cardo Distillery was able to boast in 1894 that they were the only distillery in the area that didn't need to affix the word Glenlivet to its original name. This was not a practice that suddenly stopped either, but rather faded away, with the distilleries moving more to simply using their own name, and with Speyside being introduced as an alternative name for the area, and being a named protected geographical indicator in the Scotch whisky regulations of 2009. In fact, Tamnavulin, built in 1966, opened as Tamnavulin Glenlivet and was still licensed as such in 2003. The independent bottler Cadenheads still use the suffix in their own bottlings. These legal battles did little to damage the growing reputation of the Glenlivet, but reputation is only part of the picture, and other problems were on the way. I often found it interesting that there was a shift in popularity between brandy and Scotch whisky. One of the factors was the increase in infrastructure within Scotland. In other words, there is a long time when it is easier for goods to be imported into England from France and Spain than it was from Scotland. As the shift moved, along with the growth of blending, the whisky industry boomed. As it did so, the distilleries opened and production increased. The industry grew and grew until it didn't, and then it slumped. Overproduction led to a glut and a crash. Prohibition in the USA, 2 world wars, and even levels of prohibition in parts of Scotland had devastating effects. Many distilleries closed, and in doing so, many areas were hit with unemployment. Farmers were unable to sell their harvest, and legal restraints were imposed. This led to the Glenlivet temporarily closing, but I am unsure when. Most of the internet states that this happens in World War II, but material that I have that is published by Glenlivet itself says that it was World War I in 1917 due to grain shortages and government restrictions. By 1933, the Glenlivet and Glen Grant were the only malt distilleries left open in the whole of Scotland, and in 1952 they joined together as one company. And as bad times come, so bad times can go, and the industry began to recover. In 1947, Glenlivet was part of another small landmark when the USA Pullman Company restocked their trains with Glenlivet miniatures. The Glenlivet started by having the courage to do something new. It was risky and hard work, but it was done with courage and conviction. In many ways, that is the thrust of Glenlivet. It is not a story of easy-won success and effortless triumph. It is a story of pushing forward, being new, working hard, and taking the risk. It has changed stills, changed location, built and rebuilt, had ups and downs, but kept on. It should be no surprise then that it has been at the forefront of continuous development. It began with a small still, then it grew. In 1895, 18 years after its first appearance in Scotland, it had a telephone put in, and the following year it had electricity installed, along with a second pair of stills. In 1920, the stills became coal-fired. Then in 1972, they changed to gas-fired. The following year, the number of stills grew from 4 to 6 and then to 8 in 1978. In 1981 through to 1986, all the stills changed again and are converted to steam heating. And in 2010, the distillery officially opened the next stage of major developments. Whilst keeping harmony with its surroundings and traditions, it became bigger and incorporated modern technologies. Another 6 stills were added, almost doubling its number. A careful balance was achieved that created a continuation of the historic whilst utilising the new. Harmonious, open, practical and sensitive, it aimed to meet the needs in a sensitive way into the future. 12 years later, and a project began that gave context to the new development. This was a reflection of the length of time that Glenlivet has been with us, in the sense that the original distillery site was chosen for a 2-week-long archaeological dig. The same year saw the return of some very special barley. This was barley that had been sent into space by the University of Guelph, Ontario, Canada, 1 year earlier. On its return, it had been planted to be harvested and turned into whisky at Glenlivet, and the area was temporarily renamed Speyside. As a further statement to Glenlivet's longevity, whisky specialist Gordon MacPhail made a very special release. Back in February 1940, John Urquhart and his son George laid down an American oak cask, number 336, full of Glenlivet whisky. In February 2025, 85 years later, they released it in 125 numbered decanters designed by American architect Gene Gang. Number 1 was auctioned for charity by Christie's for $200,000. with the remaining decanters going on sale at £125,000 each. Then, later the same year, collector Nguyen Din Tuan Viet, also known as the King of Spirits, added the world's oldest fully intact bottle of whisky to his existing collection that already included a bottle of 1772 rum and 1696 cognac. The whisky was an 1843 Old Glenlivet.